it's Whispering Storyteller here. I hope you're well. Today is my 100th video upload, and to celebrate that, I thought I'd do something a little poignant and timely. So I am commemorating the men, women and children who were caught up in the Great War, World War I. And to commemorate this event, I am going to read extracts from a secret diary kept by a British soldier, and his name was Harry Drinkwater. Now, it was forbidden under British government to have a diary because, of course, if it fell in the hands of the enemy, it would give everything away. So Harry kept this diary, which gives a very detailed day-by-day account on his experiences in the trenches in the Somme, and it gives the reader a sense of truly being there. It's very visceral and very detailed. The section I'm going to read today is in the first third of the diary. It covers December 1914 to January 1915, and we will experience Harry arriving at the trenches in Suzanne in the Somme, and his experiences there in the dugouts, and his day-to-day relentless attacks, and of course a battle with the atrocious weather that the guys had to endure. So I do hope you share a thought for those fallen heroes, both sides of the fence, and remember those who gave their lives in the Great War. Thank you. Sunday the 5th of December 1915. We saw a bit of real warfare this morning. 6 of our aeroplanes were making observation over the enemy line, and it was interesting to see shells bursting all around them. Each shell leaves a black cloud to show where it burst. This afternoon we had football. This evening I'm filling in time with the help of a candle, writing up in my diary and writing home. Afterwards, to sink down to sleep. The same with us all. The 6th of December 1915. Today we have been for a short route march and see for the first time the British trenches like a white streak on the skyline. We joke about our entry into them, and I'm conscious that we shall have a rude awakening when we get there. We appear to be here for some time and have an opportunity to look around. Tuesday the 7th of December 1915. What a great contrast all of this is to England. Dirty cottages, half barns, half dwelling houses. The roads have no sort of walking path, and the buildings appear to be the last stages of decay. The principal refuse place is a pond in the centre of a village, of which everything is thrown. With no idea of sanitation, the few people I have seen are in keeping with their surroundings. Among this evil-smelling lot we live and have our being. We are billeted in barns, and last night I woke to hear something gnawing up my haversack, and spent the remainder of the time patting the straw to keep off what seemed an army of rats. In the morning I found a large hole eating in my haversack. They were after biscuits. It would be the best thing that could happen if the Germans blew the whole place up. Wednesday the 8th of December 1915. We are degenerating into first-class animals. Reveal, 7 a.m, breakfast, a rasher of bacon. This we ate on a slice of bread with fingers and jackknife and a mug of tea. 1 p.m. bully beef stew, precious little fresh meat about, and 4:30 p.m. tea. This consists of a mug of tea and anything we've been able to save from our day's rations. In each instance we retire to the straw of our billet and feed. Our enamel mug serves as a double purpose for tea and a plate for bully stew, which is often used for washing in. A clasp knife and fingers take place of all cutlery. Thursday the 9th of December 1915. The 14th Battalion, 1st Birmingham Pals, who were billeted in an adjacent village, returned today from 4 days in the line. Their first experience. They tell tales of the mud. Their clothes do not belly their story. Looking out of my billet this morning, I see a squad of men pass by. They were unique, plastered from head to feet with mud. It would have been difficult to find on them a clean part the size of a man's hand. Another fellow came to the billet door and watched them as they passed. We looked at one another. Remarks were unnecessary. Friday the 10th of December, 1915. Today we have done very little. Excessive movement is not allowed, owing to possibilities of enemy aircraft. Saturday the 11th of December, 1915. Great excitement today. Burnt our billet down. First noticed the outbreak about 9 o'clock this morning, and soon got to work with buckets of water. The fire alarm was given. The battalion turned out en bloc. Also the village fire brigade, 3 old men and a pump. The fire had got a good hold of the barn, and eventually we were able to confine the blaze to an old building. It took all morning to put it out. We had great support, killing rats which ran in all directions. Also cattle, a horse, pigs and sheep were killed. Damages claimed £120. Sunday the 12th of December 1915. B and D companies leave to take up their position in the line. Our battalion appears to be relieving the West Kents, who returned here early this morning. They look very tired and fed up and plastered in mud. They do not appear very jovial over the prospects of winter. The weather very sharp this morning, snow, and later in the day it poured down with rain. We leave here on Thursday for Suzanne, our depot for the trenches. Then leave for what festivities the trenches have for us on Friday, we wonder. Editorial Note. Before any newly arrived new army battalion was allowed to resume responsibility for a sector of the front line, it had first to undergo instruction in trench warfare under the guidance of a more experienced unit. In this way, it was hoped that routines, tips and hard-learned lessons could be handed down to the inexperienced, so that the trenches could continue to be manned efficiently and unnecessary casualties avoided. In the case of Harry's battalion, the instructors were the professional soldiers of what had been existing pre-war battalions, the 1st Battalion, the Devonshire Regiment, and the 2nd Battalion, the Manchester Regiment of the 15th Infantry Division, which had been in this sector since the previous August. Tuesday the 14th of December, 1915. A beautifully clear frosty morning, short route march and football in the afternoon. Watched an air raid in the distance over enemy lines. The aeroplanes were a fine sight, 14 in all, going over in file, and as each one came within the enemy shelling area, it was treated to a round of shells. As I viewed all of this, I was glad I was on the ground, fairly safe for the time being. As a result of the fire, smoking is prohibited in barns. Personally, I'm not taking any notice of it. I imagine the brigadier snug in his room at the headquarters in the front of a good fire, while we are in these wretched places and cannot keep warm, have nothing to do at night except write letters and slowly sink into the straw and sleep. Lights out, 8:30 p.m. Wednesday the 15th of December, 1915. I received a parcel from home for Christmas. Contents very useful for the trenches. We hear how we leave for Suzanne en route for the trenches tomorrow. Rumours came to the village that the D Company, who left here on the 12th, have had their first casualty. Thursday the 16th of December 1915, Suzanne. Arrived here today. A very hard march. Left Somme and punctually at 10:30 a.m. and got here at 4:30 p.m. Find rumours regarding the D Company casualty only too true. Lieutenant Crisp, a very decent fellow, was hit by a bullet or fragment of shell on one of those expeditions, which had no special object but to keep the enemy from thinking we were asleep. The price is too great. We were billeted in tents, 12 men in each, in the grounds of what in England would be a mansion. We are now encamped between the enemy and our own heavy guns, and the heavy artillery fire we have heard so long is now quite close. As I write, I can hear shells tearing through the air. 15 seconds to travel about 4 miles. We listen and hear them explode in the distance. Especially we hear bursts of machine gun fire. We are very close to things here. Last night as I lay in the tent, I could feel the ground vibrate as each shell was fired. The grounds of this place are very fine, very extensive. Here and there it's a lake and once large flower beds. Now everything is a quagmire. Constant traffic of guns and wagons passing has made it boot deep in mud, and what might have once been a very fine lawn is now standing room for horses with a covering overhead to keep from observation. At night time, the camp looks very peculiar, the tents plastered with paint to make them obscure from air observation. One sees little slits of light all down the lines, those shining in the puddles of water outside, giving the impression of a fairyland, but not much of fairyland in reality. Our boots are perpetually wet and feet cold. Editorial Note. Harry added here, afterwards I saw the owner of this place, a Count Somme, a suspected spy in the German payment. He was only allowed out accompanied by an escort. His mansion was but practically the only building left intact in the whole village. He was eventually found giving information to the Germans and shot. Less than 12 hours after his death, the village was shelled and laid flat, including his mansion. We left that village and that part of the country half an hour after the bombardment started. We were lucky. Tonight we had our first rum issue, and it did go down good. Each spot seemed to warm a blood vessel and circulate the blood around the body. 8:30 p.m. we rolled on our blankets. Occasionally we hear the splish-splash of some fellow moves from one tent to another, or the plod of a sentry picking his way over the puddles as he moves up and down the tents. These sounds seemed at time to cease only with a continual shriek of shells that disturbed the night. Tomorrow we go into the trenches and start a 15 months what we've been training for. I wonder what sort of show we will make. Page, our Lance Corporal, has been rushing around all day trying to find fellows who've already been in the line, getting tips about general conditions and the best way of getting over them. Already he is a fine little soldier. I think he will rise to great heights in times of difficulty. Lieutenant Crisp was buried today. Editorial Note. For a PALS battalion made entirely of Kitchener volunteers, the first casualty suffered on active service came as a great blow and a memorable event. In addition to losing 2nd Lieutenant Crisp, the second officer to die, the battalion lost 2 NCOs during D Company's first instructional tour of duty in the trenches. Corporal Daniel Greasley, 25, and 31-year-old Percy Broomfield. Daniel Greasley of Alum Rock and Birmingham had enlisted in the Birmingham PALS on the 26th of September 1914. At the time of his death, he'd been married for 9 months. Percy Broomfield lived in the Garston Green area of Birmingham before joining up. Both men now lie in Greasley Gailey Military Cemetery, 7 miles southwest of the town of Albert on the Somme. Ernest Geoffrey Crisp, 24, was the battalion bombing or grenade officer. He'd worked for Lloyd's Bank and enlisted as a private in the 7th Battalion of the North Hampshire Regiment on the outbreak of war before being commissioned as an officer. Joining Harry's battalion on the 8th of February 1915, he was hit first by a bullet and by shell fragments as he made his way back to the British trenches after an instructional bombing expedition on the afternoon of the 5th of December 1915. He died of his wounds the following day. He lies today in Suzanne Communal Cemetery Extension. Sunday the 19th of December 1915. We are now in the trenches, and the paper fails to describe the situation. It is not the Germans we are fighting here, but the weather. We left Suzanne at 4 p.m. yesterday for here, a distance of around 2 miles. We had a very cheery send-off. We halted halfway along the road at a house and put on jack boots and leather jerkins, and after a short halt, started off again. In about an hour's time, we were up to our knees in mud and water. We are now indulging in a new experience. Jack boots. These are actually fishermen's waders, reaching up to the thigh. In these we tramped along the road the remainder of the distance before entering the trenches. We were told to walk quietly, but that was impossible. These waders were all cases miles too large and added to our other kit, which now had boots slung around us. We had gone perhaps a mile and reached a farm building, and word was passed back in a whisper to go steady. As far as I could see the very indistinct light, the men in front of me appeared to be walking through a wall, and then to disappear. The fellow in front of me followed, and I followed him into what was the kitchen of a house, down into the cellar, and out into the communication trench, through a hole which had been knocked through the wall. At first the mud was ankle deep, and gradually got deeper and deeper as we advanced along the communication trench. We had not gone far before we had to duck. The enemy was sending over their evening salute of shells which were dropping around us. Very light and new experience for us, seemed to be sent up by the Germans in every direction. The effect was very weird in the night. By this time, getting along the trench was an awful strain. To do so, I had to use both elbows, one each side of the trench, and with the added leverage of pull one leg out, step forward, and repeat again. Further encumbrance by rifles, kits, rations and boots which I had slung about me. It was the same with us all. About 1.5 hours of the worst plodding in mud I've ever experienced, or ever want to experience again, we reached the firing line. My luck was out. No sooner had I arrived than I was told off with the officers as a ration party had to fetch up the grub. Back we had to wade through the whole length of trenches to our field kitchen situated in an adjacent village called Maricourt, arriving there midnight. These first journeys up and down the trenches I shall not forget easily. The first journey we had our kit to carry. This time it was a dixie of stew. As we carried on a pole slung between two men, and when we arrived back we discovered half of it was missing, partly spilt over our clothes. The weight had taken us further in the mud, and every step was a tug. After dishing out the stew to what fellows I could find, I groped my way to the dugout where I was told I would be staying with other fellows. What a sight! The dugout was a foot deep in mud, and everyone was too tired to try to do anything. It was now 1:30 a.m, and I joined in with the rest and stood against the wall and waited for the morning. It is perhaps impossible to visualize this scene without some knowledge of the trenches. To do so, one must imagine a room dug underneath the ground, dug probably more than a year ago, and now in a state of decay, the sides of which are slimy with moisture which had percolated through. Here and there prop, perhaps, the trunk of a tree, supported the roof, which, like the sides, was foul with moisture, and as it gathered in weight, dropped down. In places it amounted to a steady drip, drip, and did not seem to cease, but with the result of what our advent, the floor was some foot or more deep in mud. There were no bunks into which we could climb into to get away from it. The size and height did not allow it. Our heads nearly touched the roof. There was no possibility of having a brazier here. There was no firm ground to hold it or stand upon. There was no exit, and the air was still. In this place I groped my way, now brilliantly lit by candles stuck to the wall. Some of the fellows, about a dozen, already a mass of mud from our efforts trying to get along the communication trench, were ranged along the sides, and one or two were leaning against the roof supports. This was our first introduction to the trenches and a dugout. I joined them and stood against the wall. The cold was intense, and nearly all the dugouts here were in the same condition. The smell which arose from the stale mud was rancid. We stirred it every time we moved our feet. Monday the 20th of December, 1915. The trouble I had expected with my feet did not develop. I was fortunate to get a large pair of jackboots and greased my feet and put on 3 pairs of socks when changing into jackboots. The trenches are in a terrible condition, anything from 4 inches to 4 feet deep in mud and water. We're in a terrible condition ourselves, plastered in mud right up to our faces. Our food of cold bacon, bread and jam is all together in a sack hung from the roof of the dugout, for which the water is continually dropping. We eat and drink mud. At the time of writing, the communication trench has been heavily shelled. In this district, at this time, the military situation is very peculiar. The British firing line is in the shape of a horseshoe, we occupying the most advanced part. It is useless for us to try and fill the flanks are straightened out, so we can only keep the Germans occupied. The front trenches of the Germans and ourselves are situated between two villages, we occupying one, they the other. Both could be razed to the ground by opposing artillery inside an hour, but there appears to be a mutual understanding that they shall be more or less left alone. Tuesday the 21st of December, 1915. Some attempt was made today to continue the diary, but my hands, perpetually caked in mud and stone cold, refused to perform the somewhat delicate operation of writing. Added to this, I had nowhere to sit down. I gave up trying. Saturday the 25th of December, 1915. Writing now on Christmas night and looking back over the last 6 days, 5 of which we have been in the trenches, we are thankful that we are still able to walk and not be carried back to the billets. The Germans have been little or no account compared to the conditions of which we found ourselves. We have had to fight against the weather, short rations, a lack of fuel, and wet dugouts, a combination of things likely to knock out the strongest. Sleep, we've only been able to have at short periods when it could be spared, and always standing up in mud. Rats, for which we've heard so much about, we experienced, and often during the night, when from sheer exhaustion I dozed off, I'd be wakened by one of these fat squeaking things on my shoulder, or feel it running over my head. I had approximately an hour's sleep a day. Rations, which look very nice and inviting on paper, we never had, partly owing to the fact that it had been raining hard, filling up the communication trenches to such an extent it was impossible to get along, and partly because they were constantly being shelled night and day by the Germans, so that provisions had to be carried over the top at night. Tea, intended to be hot, we received at midnight, stone cold. Coke to burn out the dugouts had been left at the rear to allow for more provisions to be carried. The dugouts, which had been shelled and shaken for nearly 12 hours, let in water like a sieve, so that we are not enabled to keep our bodies even dry, and it is impossible to repair them owing to exposure to the Germans. So we've had to lump it. In moving along the trenches, we've had to use our elbows for added leverage. Consequently, the mud worked through our clothes to the body, setting up irritation. Our hands were always caked in mud, which, when we ate our bread and bacon, went down the same way, setting up many cases of acute dysentery amongst fellows. On arriving at the firing line, we took over from the 1st Devons. They remaining one night with us to show us how to go on. His sentry post consisted of 3 men, one on actual duty looking over the top, one by his side in the trench, and a 3rd man sleeps. This rotates every hour. If the post is a dangerous part, then 2 men take the place of one. In common with others, I did my regular turns. It's a very creepy business looking over the top. Imagine every noise is a German. A rat skirmishing among empty tins in no man's land is quite sufficient to attract all attention. Sentry duties stop 1 hour before dusk, when every man in the line stands ready for anything to happen. In the morning, the same thing happens again. 1 hour before daybreak, every man stands in the trench until daylight. This is the survival of an old custom in war of making an attack just before dawn or sunset. This manning of the front line is in fact a preparation in case an attack takes place, and is called stand to, and it occurs every day 1 hour before daybreak and 1 hour before sunset, and lasts about 1 hour. It is general custom amongst all armies. Tuesday morning, 21st of December, we had a very heavy bombardment from the Germans about 11 a.m. I was in a trench at the time and moved to a dugout. Heard a fearful crash and found the next dugout to ours blown to blazes, and Sergeant Horton with it. Sergeant Horton had been our physical drill instructor since the beginning of things. He was a fellow I liked. As soon as I heard the crash, I made my way out with the help of Sergeant Frederick Wassell. We dug him out. He was near a gunner. Wassell and I carried him to the rear. Before we could get him anywhere near a dressing station, he had departed this life. He was our first casualty and our first experience of death. We were all very sick about it, and thankful to leave the trenches that night for a night's sleep back at camp. On arrival, I lay down and went to sleep in my clothes, tired out, and with the death of Horton, sick of everything. Up again early next morning, making preparations for returning to the line, only to find my kit had been lost, so I was now unable to shave. I had not shaved for some days now. We arrived back at those fearful places at dusk and relieved the first East Surreys and started the eternal routine work all over again. When not on sentry duty, we employ the night trying to pump water from the trenches, and in the daytime stand in the dugouts concealed from observation. Last night we had another lively time on sentry when the German artillery opened up on us again. I had a narrow squeak, a shell burst on the parapet. I was well wedged in the mud and heard it coming. Unable to move, I crouched at the side of the trench and got covered in dirt. I was glad enough when morning came and we were able to shake ourselves out. Yesterday evening we left the trenches and arrived back here at 10 o'clock. The feeling of walking on firm or comparatively firm road again is indescribable. To have to plod one's way through the trenches, tugging at one's leg out of the mud, then to put it forward and tug at the other, is distracting to a degree. Add this to the conditions under which we were living, knowing that when you were in the mud, you were helpless to move quickly, is a strain that must eventually have its effect. To be able to walk quickly on firm ground instead of always feeling the ground give way under your feet has an effect. Some fellows were singing on arrival. We were down in our billets. Mine, with others, was a barn. Blankets had been brought up for us, and into those we rolled into a thankful sleep. This morning, Christmas Day, we awakened at 8 a.m, and I had my first wash and shave for a week. My kit being recovered by the company quartermaster sergeant. I took my shirt off. It was thick with dried mud, and put a clean one on. The first change since leaving England. I felt like a new man afterwards. The dirty ones had already gone to wash, and I fell under a parade for that purpose at 10 a.m. We had one tub and no soap between about 50 fellows, and heaven knows how they were going to dry. Our Christmas dinner consisted of greasy mutton and plum pudding sent by the Mayor of Birmingham. This afternoon I had been on fatigue work drawing rations till 5 p.m, afterwards tea, and from then onwards I had been writing hard on my diary, for I have an idea how I should like to keep it up, a record of my wanderings and experience. Editorial Note. Albert Horton was 29. He's buried in Creasley Gailey Military Cemetery. Harry had been wearing the same shirt for 34 days. Sunday the 26th of December 1915, Maricourt. We were not allowed to enjoy our comfort for long. We marched here this evening for another tour of duty. We are told that this time we shall have more variety. I wonder what that means. We're here for 6 days, 2 days in the trenches, 2 days in support, and 2 days in the Maricourt defences. The latter is the last line of resistance, supposing the Germans were to break through the front line. Monday the 27th of December, 1915. As one half of the battalion is relieving the other, C and D are up on the line tonight and tomorrow night. A and B are in the Maricourt defences. Very easy going here. We are not allowed outside of our billet in the daytime, so we sleep all day to emerge at night, sandbagging and trench digging in the vicinity. Thursday and Wednesday, the 28th and 29th of December, 1915. We moved up into support this evening, and things are not so comfortable. Although we have no sentry duty to do, we have to work all night up to our knees in mud and water, pumping out the latter. At intervals along the communication trenches, sumps have been cut into the side. Thursday and Friday the 30th and 31st of December 1915. We saw the old year out and the new year in fine style. We moved up last night for our last 2 days of the tour, relieved the men there, and took over the firing line. The conditions are still the same, up against the weather, not the Germans, nearly up to our waists in mud. But we have found a new diversion. In between light and dusk, we have a small piece of cheese on the end of our bayonet on the rifle and wait for some fat rat to come and have a nibble, then pull the trigger. This evening, or strictly speaking, should I say last evening, I'm writing this at 3 a.m. in the corner of a dugout. A party of wire cutters left our trench at 11:45 to repair the barbed wire. They were spotted by the enemy, who opened fire and was taken up by machine guns and artillery, to which we replied. Saturday the 1st of January 1916. At midnight I was crouched up against the side of the trench, seeking protection from shells bursting overhead and very close to the parapet. The shells appeared to be going all directions, and whilst we were sending them over, we came to the conclusion that it had nothing to do with our men out in front, but was a New Year's salute. We wished each other a happy New Year along the trench. Nevertheless, I was very thankful when it was over. Our fellows came in from the wiring. No one hit. I've had 1 more hour's sentry duty to work before daybreak. Tomorrow we go back to Suzanne and rest for 2 days. Sunday the 2nd of January 1916, Suzanne. I left the trenches last night for a day's rest back here. It's only a day's rest mentally, as physically there is something to be done all day long. Rifle inspection, ammunition inspection, boots inspection. The quartermaster comes along and makes up all of our deficiencies. Take this opportunity to change our shirts and socks and wash the dirty ones. It's a glorious feeling after a week in one's clothes to have a wash and shave and a clean change of clothing. Friday the 7th of January 1916, back in billets. We relieved the Devons on the night of the 3rd. Relieving one another is a creepy business. It is usual for one being relieved to send a man to some point decided on beforehand, and when he pilots us to those we are going to relieve by the best way, nearly always over the top when possible, but sometimes along the trenches, splish splash as we go along, wondering why the Germans do not hear us. Tonight they did. One fellow stumbled over a tin of some sort and kicked up a dickens of a clatter. Up went the Very lights from the German lines, and over came a shower of bullets. But we had ducked by this time, and they did not spot us. It's a very nervy business, and like most other things, we are glad when it is over. Roughly, our position for the next 3 days is to occupy the knob, listening for any movement on part of the Germans. Wedged in mud ourselves, we were helpless, except to keep watch and fire our rifles. The Germans were probably as helpless. Being in the line for 3 days is a long time. Very, very long time under these conditions. Food can only be brought to us at night, which is our meal for the following day. Tonight, 9 p.m, the ration party has just been along, bringing us our hot drink for the night. They've had to carry it 1.5 miles, and by their language I believe it had been a pretty rough journey. The tea is stone cold. When we go to rest and return under the line again, we do not necessarily occupy the same front-line trench as the previous time, but an adjoining one in part of a line which also comes under control of the battalion. In this particular case, the line was isolated. There were no dugouts or shelters. It was too close to the German lines, so we stood in the trench. We were on duty all night, and when day came, we waded off to a dugout to sleep, leaving one man on sentry, who was relieved by us every hour. The duty here is light but very nervy owing to the possibility of bombing attacks by the Germans. We are not allowed to leave the trench from dusk till dawn, so through the night I took my turn with the other fellows, an hour on sentry duty, gazing over the top into nothing. Bitterly cold, I feel numb to the bone. We are up to our knees in mud. Breakfast at 7:30 a.m. under an hour's stand to. Breakfast consists of a slice of bread and bacon and a drink from our water bottles. Bitterly cold last night, raining hard with a keen wind blowing and no means of keeping warm. I longed for the daylight when I could creep into some dugout. This came at last, and with the remaining fellows not on duty, we crept off to the nearest shelter and huddled ourselves together for what warmth we could get. During the day, we each did a turn of fire step duty, the fellow coming off the place in the dugout of the one who had gone on. Occasionally a fellow would get up, have a munch at something, and for the most part, except when we were on duty, we stayed all day where we had laid down in the morning. Stand to at 4:30 p.m, and I watched the murky day turn to darkness. In this part of the line, we have no contact with the outside world, so wait for the ration party to arrive, and as one event during the next 24 hours. With the ration party come in letters for us. Very pathetic it is sometimes to watch these fellows read. Every few moments they bring them out and reread them again or crawl off to some temporary shelter and with the aid of a torch held low, read and reread again. This is our only touch with a civilization which we feel we are losing contact with. The night passed quietly. Stand to at 6:30 a.m. It is usually a creepy business watching the day break and straining to see signs of the enemy. Night again. The ration party has just been along bringing rumours. We hear that we are to be brigaded with Devons, and after this tour of 6 days will return with them to the rear and offer small prayers that it may be so. The tea that they have just brought up is funny stuff, made by the cook somewhere in the rear over a wood fire. The water, which is smoked in consequence, is brought to them in petrol tins, recently in use, and when made into dishes is used for stew, so we get a mixture of stew, smoke, petrol, tea, all stone cold, always stone cold. I could not drink mine. I had a try and it came up again. If nothing matters, I'm getting out of this. This afternoon the Germans gave us some hate in the shape of artillery fire. Shrapnel was flying around the trenches in all directions for a time. Lieutenant Hemus was hit in the leg and has lain in a dugout all day waiting for stretcher bearers to come and take him away. They arrived at dusk. I do not envy stretcher bearers under these conditions. Good fellows. They swore till they were blue in the face, getting Hemus along the trench, themselves nearly up to their waists in mud. Last night I occupied a listening post close to the German lines and could occasionally hear them singing. The smell is awful and rats run all over the place. At last relief came. Word was passed along at dusk that we were to be relieved that night at 8 p.m. Forms loomed up in the mist at the back of us, and we heard strange whispers and many curses. They were the Manchester Pals battalion coming to take over. It takes very few moments for the relieved man to hand over all information he has regarding the enemy. I was on sentry duty at the time of their arrival, and quickly handed over to the man taking my place, and with the rest of the platoon made my way to the rear and to the billets. It's wretched business relieving and being relieved, the darkness adding to the confusion. We plodded our way through the trench for some distance, and when not in direct line of the enemy rifle fire, scrambled out of the trench to the firmer ground and make our way to the rear. Occasionally I look back and German Vari lights were going up there and here along the line, making the night seem very weird. We arrived in billets at 10 p.m. very tired and lay down in our togs and slept. I have slept most of the day today, too tired to move. This evening I've had a wash and clean up, the best part of a wretched business.